On Tuesday, March the 19th, 1907, the Coolgardie district of Western Australia experienced heavy unseasonal rain in the nearby town of Bonnyvale. In particular, the rain was torrential, and despite desperate attempts to shore up the opening of the Westralia and East Extension gold mine, the water poured in, bringing with it hundreds of tons of silt, timber, sheets of iron, and other debris. When the mine manager realized the danger to the 200 miners working below, he sounded the alarm. However, the man skips, which are small containers used to transport miners up and down the incline shaft, were out of action because of the floodwaters, so the men had to fight their way up slippery ladders in the vertical shaft against the onrushing tide of water. Of the 12 levels in the mine, the 3 lowest, almost up to level 9, were found to be inundated. This is the story of the Bonnyvale disaster of 1907. The late 1840s saw a significant event in American history known as the Gold Rush, which occurred along the west coast. However, what many may not be aware of is that a similar event took place in Australia during the exact same time. In 1851, a prospector discovered flecks of gold in a waterhole near Bathurst, Australia, which led to the discovery of more gold in neighbouring states. Victoria, home to Melbourne, had the most significant discovery of gold. The Australian gold rush had a profound impact on the country's national identity and provided an opportunity for people from all over the world to move to Australia. Within a year, over 500,000 people, known as diggers, rushed to the goldfields across the country. Many of these diggers were immigrants from Great Britain, with the rest coming from Germany, Italy, Poland, and the United States. As immigrants flooded the areas in search of gold, the locals felt the need to join in, leaving their stable jobs to seek fortune in the goldfields. As a result, wages in certain areas doubled, as finding workers became increasingly difficult during this time. This gold rush lasted for about a decade, but the infrastructure left behind continued to operate well into the 1900s, with many gold mines remaining operational. The Australian gold rush had a significant impact on the country, not only in terms of its economic growth, but also in shaping its national identity. Although 50 years later, one of those diggers who immigrated from Europe was Modesto Vericetti. Coming from Italy in the early 1900s, Modesto was keen on any opportunity to support his family. Born in 1874 in Corona of northern Italy, Modesto was pushed right outside his first mining job at the age of 13. Gornell being a mining town an hour outside of Milan, so Modesto was destined at an early age to help out where he could inside the mines, quickly marrying his wife Maria in the next few years. She would die while giving birth to their 5th child in 1905. While this was a traumatic event for Modesto's, it was the spark he needed to take advantage of, an opportunity to further his family's wealth and future well-being. For the past few years before her death, his local Catholic church had been suggesting he and other men go to Australia for the plentiful and abundant earnings in the mining field. Finally deciding he wanted to have a chance at making a fortune for his family at the age of 25, he made the move to Australia with his 2 brothers. First looking for work includes Victoria. He and his brothers jumped back and forth from Italy to Victoria over the next couple of years before settling down in 1906 in the town of Bonnyvale. Dubbed the Golden Outback of West Australia, Modesto was attracted to the West Australia and Eastern Extension mine that was located here. This extension mine, which was operational for the past several decades, sat between 2 valleys and was at the base of their connection. As this region is usually extremely dry with little to no large rainstorms each year, locals were never concerned about flooding in the area. That was until March the 19th, 1907. Now, Modesto was a tough cookie. As stated before, he had been working in the mine since he was 13 years old, so he knew his way around the shafts like the back of his hand. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen on that fateful day in March. Picture this. The sun was shining bright, the birds were singing, and everything was calm and peaceful. That is, until an unexpected thunderstorm hit the town of Bonnyvale. The intensity of the rainfall was so great that it seemed as if the heavens had opened up and were relentlessly pouring down torrents of water upon the unfortunate town. The storm dumped a few years' worth of rain in just 2 hours. Water rushed down every hill in the surrounding area as the local creek overflowed. Within just 2 hours, the town was practically underwater, and the local creek overflowed with a staggering 14 million gallons of water. That's enough water to fill 21 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Chaos and devastation were bound to follow. The extension mine previously mentioned, being at the base of 2 large valleys, was a perfect spot for the water to congregate. As water began pouring into the main shaft, the diggers in the mine were quickly evacuated and promptly left the cave out of fear of being trapped below, and they all thought they were safe. 200 diggers signed up for work that day, and only 199 made it out. Modesto Vericetti was one digger that did not. His workmates remembered seeing him going to level 10 on his own to work on an upward-angled extension called a rise. It became clear that he had not heard the warnings. At the time, being in the L10 section of the mine, Modesto had no time to react as the rushing water caught him by surprise, nearly 1,000 feet below the surface, and he fought his way to safety, knowing he had little to no chance of survival. But he was backed into a corner of the mine, and an air pocket formed, trapping him 720 feet below the surface. At first, the miners who had escaped believed that Modesto had perished due to the immense amount of water that had flooded the main shaft. However, their assumptions were proven wrong after fellow diggers in mine management heard tapping in the miners' code from below, indicating that Modesto was still alive. A rescue team quickly assembled at the entrance of the mine and urgently requested a high-capacity steam pump to be brought in. The high-powered steam pump, which was supposed to rescue Modesto, was pumping water out of the cavern, but it seemed like it was barely making any progress. It being only 1907, with technology not as advanced, this high-powered steam pump pumped water out of the cavern very, very slowly. By a few hours later at nightfall, the water level only dropped by a few inches. Local mining inspector Joshua Crabb reported that the clearing of the shaft would take up to a week, and there is little chance of rescue. Modesto, still trapped deep inside the flooded mine, had captured the world's attention. Newspapers all around the world took this quote and dubbed Modesto Vericetti the entombed man. They published daily papers throughout the ordeal, recounting on Modesto's signalling, calling it pointless and hopeless, saying that he would certainly suffocate or starve before the water level was low enough for rescue. Just when everyone had given up hope, a 7-year-old boy named John, the son of the local mining inspector Joshua, had an idea. "Why don't you use a diver?" he said. His father, realizing the brilliance of the idea, immediately sent for 2 expert divers from Calgary, Frank Hughes and Thomas Hearn. These 2 brave divers had never attempted a rescue like this before, having never dived a flooded cave in all their years of experience. They knew they would need experts in the caving field to assist. Regardless, they were determined to save Modesto. They called on Herbert Hoover, the highest qualified mining engineer in the goldfields that week. Hoover, who was then managing the Gwalia mine in Canada, immediately directed the rescue effort. The world held its breath as the divers prepared to descend into the flooded mine, with only their diving equipment and their bravery to guide them. But the questions remained. Would they be able to reach Modesto in time and save his life? The unfolding rescue mission for Modesto Vericetti was nothing short of a massive undertaking, involving a diverse group of individuals who rallied to save the trapped miner. Over the course of 3 days, the team grew to include more than 160 people, ranging from diggers to police to divers to many other government officials, who all gathered to help rescue Modesto. But despite their best efforts, the divers faced a major setback. They didn't have a long enough air hose to reach Modesto. The nearest one was a whopping 350 miles away in the city of Fremantle, and it seemed impossible to get it to the trapped man in time. That's when the government stepped in and ordered a special speed train, aptly named the Rescue Special, to deliver the hose with unprecedented speed. cutting off 2 hours in the usual 12-hour train ride. Having acquired the air hose, Frank Hughes made his first exploratory dive on the 4th day of their horrific ordeal. But even then, finding Modesto proved to be a difficult task. He and Thomas Hearn made 3 separate descents, 2 on day 5 and another on day 6. It wasn't until the 6th day that the pair of divers located him, after a grueling search. Hughes then resurfaced as Hearn stayed with Modesto, bringing him vital supplies like a powerful electric lamp, food, candles, and even sealed letters of encouragement from his brother Giovanni. The divers had to face the heartbreaking reality that they couldn't save Modesto, at least not with the equipment they had. The ticking clock and the dangerous conditions made it too risky for them to suit up and resurface with Modesto. The divers would resurface without Modesto, as time wasn't on their side. The steam pump was working, but it wasn't enough. The rescue plan became more desperate as Hughes delivered the grim news to Joshua Crabb on day 8 that they were running out of time, and Modesto's chances of survival were dwindling. It seemed like a hopeless situation, until day 9. Their prayers were answered. The water level finally dropped enough for an exit attempt. Thursday, March the 28th, 1907, was the climactic final day of the rescue attempt. The road from Coolgardie was packed with sightseers from an early hour, even though the rescue was not scheduled until later in the day. The divers brought Modesto one last batch of supplies and shared a cigarette with him before tying a rope around his waist and starting the long trek back to the surface through waist and knee-deep muck. Although the water level was low at some stages, the mud and water made it a treacherous journey, with Modesto barely able to keep his head above the water at times. Hughes felt Modesto collapse, so he carried him on his shoulder the rest of the way, where Hearn assisted to get him up to level 9. But he never gave up, and after a total of 206 hours underground, he staggered back to the surface on March the 28th. He was noted to have a peculiar, unhealthy look about him, and, from all appearances, according to a reporter of the day, Modesto looked like he could have been dead. Thus, a remarkable rescue attempt came to its conclusion. Against seemingly insurmountable odds, a man was rescued by a combination of determination, courage, inventiveness, and some degree of luck in what must be one of the most heroic episodes in Australian history. The divers and the mine manager were recognised publicly. Frank Hughes, especially, was given hero status, but, typical of so many of that era, was extremely modest of his role in the rescue and kept out of the public limelight. Modesto described his 9-day ordeal as extremely dark, extremely dirty, and extremely wet, an experience he would never forget. Despite the trauma he endured, Modesto Vericetti continued to live and work in the Western Australian goldfields, but shunned publicity and notoriety, dying at the age of 46 of pulmonary fibrosis. Bonneville has disappeared with just a sign indicating the town site, amongst the bush where a dramatic event occurred in 1907. But his legacy lives on, thanks to the classic Australian folk group Cloud Street, whose most famous song is dedicated to Modesto's story, called Down the Coal Mine. The city of Calgary also set up a display to honour Modesto's story and the brave men who helped rescue Modesto over a century ago. So there you have it, the incredible tale of Modesto Vericetti. In the heart of Hays County, Texas, lies a clear, calm pool of water. It's undeniably beautiful, and it's one of the most dangerous diving spots in the entire world. These serene waters are a gateway to deep, sunken caves, and it is here that at least 12 people, including experienced divers, have lost their lives. But what makes this seemingly idyllic spot so dangerous? And what is it about those crystal clear waters that draws people in? Jacob's Well, despite what the name implies, is not a well at all. It's actually an artesian spring, an underground cave system 140 feet deep and over 4,300 feet in length. This natural phenomenon, the second largest fully submerged cave in Texas, has existed for untold millennia, though the first written mention of it came from Jacob de Cova back in the 19th century. Because of this, some believe the spring was named after him. The water that feeds the deceptively calm spring comes from an underground reservoir known as the Trinity Aquifer, which keeps the water at an ideal 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius all year round. Since the Lone Star State is known for its scorching summers, it's hardly surprising that many people flock to Jacob's Well in the summer months. Just beyond the surface of this oasis lurks a deep mystery, an irresistible siren song to many would-be explorers. And so, in order to understand why it is so easy to run into trouble in Jacob's Well, you need to know how the cave structure is shaped. In the first part of the caves, which is visible from the surface, features a vertical shaft reaching 25 feet down, culminating in a false bottom. Many people have safely dived their way down to this point before looking back up and letting the aquifer's outflow help them back toward the blue sky above the water surface. If you test this false bottom, however, you can find a hidden chamber with a low ceiling that leads on at a downward angle for 75 feet. At the end of the chute is a narrow crawl space that connects to a narrow room with a high ceiling containing an air pocket. If you reach this spot, then a tight squeeze is all that separates you from an enticing area known as the fourth passage. The passage to this fourth chamber had already claimed numerous lives, and, as we will see, it was still hungry for more. 20-year-old Kent Morpin wasn't worried about Jacob's Well's dangerous reputation. He was an experienced diver, working as assistant instructor at a Pasadena dive shop, and he was aware of the risk. He also knew that at least 4 others had lost their lives trying to explore the fourth passage, but Kent believed that he and his friend, 21-year-old Mark Brasher, knew what they were doing. Kent and Mark entered Jacob's Well shortly after midnight on September the 9th, 1979. Part of a larger group of around 20. They had arrived to the area late, but while the others set up camp, the 2 young men, along with a few others, decided that they just couldn't resist a late-night dive. Mark and Kent had not shared their plans of attempting this passage with the other divers in the group, so after they all made their way down to the false bottom, navigating through the first chamber with relative ease as planned, the other divers were surprised to find the 2 young men heading for the dangerous fourth passage, despite not having safety lines or backup flashlights. Kent, then Mark, took off their tanks to fit through the 18-inch wide entrance and slipped into the passage. Joe Moyer, another diver in the group, watched in horror as Mark vanished into the tunnel. He knew that Kent and Mark's steel tanks held less air than his aluminium one, and considering he was beginning to indicate that it was time to make his way back to the surface, he knew this spelled trouble for the reckless young men. Joe tried to get Mark's attention, shining and waving his flashlight. When that didn't work, he began to hit his tank with his knife, hoping that the sound would echo in the water. But he received no reply, and the 2 young men were now out of sight. Frustrated and out of options, Joe did the only thing he still could. He propped up his flashlight and left it shining into the passage. He held on to the faint hope that he would help Kent and Mark find their way out. Joe swam back up. As he reached the surface, an eerie sight greeted him. The normally crystal clear water had turned an opaque brown. Joe's heart sank. This silty water could only mean one of 2 things. Either Kent and Mark had begun to panic, which stirred up the silt in the passage, or worse, they had been hit by a gravel slide. Regardless of which it was, Joe knew Kent and Mark were gone. The chances of surviving either of these scenarios was virtually none. About an hour later, and miles away, a former Navy diver and master scuba instructor named Dom Dibble was sound asleep when his phone began to ring. Fellow diver and police officer Paul Battaglia had called to deliver the bad news and ask for help. But the divers that would once more descend Jacob's world to look for the two young men knew that they weren't undertaking a rescue mission. Tragically, this was a body recovery. It was still dark when the rescue team arrived. The other members of Kent and Mark's diving group had already made several desperate attempts to locate them, all without success. One of the group's members had completed 290-minute dives back-to-back and told Don that he had seen Kent and Mark's bodies trapped beneath the gravel slide. At that, Don's suspicions were confirmed. The two men couldn't survive a slide like that, especially without sufficient oxygen in their tanks. Given the situation, Don was reluctant to dive before the sun rose. So, two other divers went ahead to assess the situation. They couldn't see either Kent or Mark, but they did see that the passage had become almost completely blocked with gravel. Arriving back at the surface, they expressed their concerns about the risk of a gravel slide, trapping whoever went next to the cave floors. On this advice, the decision was made to assemble a larger team and return in the daylight with more equipment. The group returned at 10 a.m. The next morning, and again 2 divers went down to assess the situation. Eventually, those 2 divers reached the passage that had been blocked with gravel and attempted to push the gravel back through the passage to create a wide enough opening for them to fit through. It didn't work. In fact, it just made things worse. Exasperated, the divers returned to the surface and reported what they found. It was at this point that Don decided to go down himself. He squeezed into his wetsuit, strapped on his gear, and, accompanied by Game Warden Calvin Turner, began the descent for themselves. The 2 men made their way down carefully, leaving 2 extra tanks along the way. At last, they reached the opening that Kent and Mark had disappeared through. Sadly, it was clear that no one else was getting through there. While they thought through their next move, Don checked how much air he had left in his tank. At the depth he'd reached, he had about 10 minutes remaining. He decided to risk it. Slowly, Don stuck his head and shoulders through the narrow opening that led to the 4th passage. In one hand, he held the safety line that tethered him to the surface, and in the other, a flashlight. For a moment, Don couldn't see anything but gravel. Then, before he could react at all, the earth began to move. Suddenly, both of his arms were trapped by the weight of another gravel slide, small rocks flowing around and over him, making it impossible for him to signal to Calvin, still treading water behind him. Visibility went down to near zero. All he could see was the swirling silt and splintering gravel, gathering closer and closer. Don panicked. He couldn't stop his breathing from intensifying as he tried to free himself. His air was running out. He couldn't move, couldn't get free, couldn't even see to try. Don came to the chilling realization that he was about to die. As the gravel continued to pour in, it seemed to bring with it a feeling of cold resignation. He was trapped. There was no moving forward and no going back. Don reasoned that since he was already suffocating, it might be better to try something desperate. He spat out his regulator and started to drink the water surrounding him. His body, in a last-ditch effort at self-preservation, began thrashing violently to free itself. Miraculously, it worked, and Don came free. A few seconds later, he began to regain his bearings, peering through his flooded mask into the murky water. Don was relieved, to say the least, when he saw Calvin passing him the spare tank's regulator. But Don's troubles were far from over. His desperate inhale from the spare tank caused some of the air to go into his stomach rather than his lung. As he and Kerwin slowly made their way back up, that trapped air began to expand. It stretched the lining of his stomach, causing Don immense pain. Finally, as they approached the surface, it could stretch no more. The trapped air burst a hole in Don's stomach. After an agonizing extraction from the water, Don was rushed to Brooke Army Medical Center, where he remained in excruciating pain for hours before they discovered the rupture and rushed him to the operating room. But while Don recovered from surgery, the search for Kent and Mark continued. Tragically, despite best efforts from some of the top experts in the field, they were unsuccessful. 12 days after they've gone missing, the search was called off. Jacob's well had swallowed the two young men, and it was intent on keeping them out of everyone's reach. Once Don had recovered, he went back to Jacob's well with a group of other divers and cemented a metal grate over the lower section of the cave system. They wanted to make sure that what happened to Kent and Mark didn't happen again. It would be decades before the world would release its two victims. Most of Mark's remains were discovered 10 years after the incident. But it wasn't until the year 2000, 21 years later, that Kent's remains were found as a part of a routine mapping dive. On the same dive, the mapping crew found that the gates cemented in place by Don Dibble had been washed away, and the mysterious fourth chamber beckoned once more. Now, Jacob's well remained open to the public, though water access requires a permit. So, if the tales of terrible things happening in the dark, flooded caverns of Jacob's well haven't scared you away, and you're an experienced diver, you can still apply to see the fourth chamber for yourself. But keep in mind, you may never see the surface again. Sitting atop a slumbering volcano, Yellowstone National Park is home to more hydrothermal activity than any other place in the world. From this to dangerous wildlife to frequently erupting geysers, this national park is made up of land that, on paper, seems like it should be too dangerous to visit. In particular, there are many hot springs found within the park. These hydrothermal features are essentially pools of water that has seeped down into the earth, becoming superheated by Yellowstone's bedrock before rising back to the surface. Despite the fact that some of these thermal pools can reach 456 degrees Fahrenheit, millions of tourists travel to these features every year, hoping to get close to one. This is largely because the pools themselves are undoubtedly beautiful. They shimmer with hues ranging from bright yellows to oranges to deep greens and blues. Interestingly, this correlation is due to microorganisms called thermophiles that thrive in the hot springs' temperatures. The Park Service has built sturdy boardwalks that allow visitors to see these beautiful sights without getting too close. But as we will see all too often, visitors blatantly disregard the many cautionary signs, walking off the boardwalks to capture a closer glimpse of these alluring waters. Sometimes, though, nature's beauty can be deadly, and these stories often end in tragedy. This is precisely what happened to 23-year-old Colin Scott in 2016. Colin and his sister Sable were touring the Norris Geyser Basin on the west side of Yellowstone National Park. Norris is one of the largest thermal basins in the park, and because it's closest to the subterranean magma than any other, it's also the hottest and most acidic. In short, it's a beautiful but extremely volatile stretch of land. The two siblings walked along the boardwalk that winds through this section of the park, admiring the intense beauty that surrounded them. But at some point, they decided that in order to get the best views, they'd need to get a little closer. Ignoring the dozens of danger signs, the pair stepped off the designated boardwalk, while Sable filmed the charming landscape near the Pork Chop Geyser. At 225 yards away from ensured safety, they began testing the waters of different pools, hoping to find a pocket of water that was hot but not too hot to soak in. This may sound alarming, but soaking in hydrothermal features called hot springs by enthusiasts is not an uncommon activity. Of course, given its inherent danger, it's also highly illegal. As Colin walked across the uneven crust to check the temperature of a pool, he suddenly slipped and fell into a strongly acidic hot spring. Still filming this entire incident, Sable attempted to rescue her brother, but her efforts were to no avail. Sadly, fully submerged as he was in superheated water, Colin was quickly overcome and sank beneath the surface. Unable to go in after her brother, and in an area with no cell reception, Sable sprinted to a nearby museum screaming for help. But when park rangers returned to the area, it was far too late. According to the incident report, rescuers could see a body floating in the water, with a small crucifix resting on the victim's face. Colin's father would later confirm that Colin wore a crucifix. Due to safety concerns and a brewing thunderstorm, they were unable to recover his body that evening. When returning the next morning, rescuers searched the pool via a long stick, but by this time, Colin's body was nowhere to be found. The temperature of the hot springs that day was reported to be a blistering 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and the acidity was recorded with a pH of 5, strongly suggesting that Colin's body quickly dissolved due to the acidity and extreme heat. Colin Scott met a tragic fate that day, but his story reminds us to never stray from established trails in the parks, especially when just one misstep can prove fatal. This next case of death by Yellowstone hot springs reminds us to be aware of our surroundings at all times and to always bring flashlights when wandering the wilderness. In August of 2000, a group of employees of the park were enjoying the end of their summer job by taking an afternoon swim in the Firehole River. Located in the west-south central of Yellowstone National Park, the Firehole River is one of 2 swimming areas inside the park. Though the name Firehole may sound menacing, it was given this moniker simply for the wisps of steam that rise from the water's surface, making it appear to be smoking as if on fire. And it's a beautifully refreshing area to take a dip, especially for young adults just looking for some after-work end-of-summer fun. But as the group enjoyed their downtime, nobody paid much attention to the fact that the sun had already begun to set, and the light was quickly fading. Because they weren't expecting to be out till dark, no one in the group thought to bring a flashlight. This didn't worry them, though, after all, they'd spent the entire summer in the park and knew this area like the backs of their hands. They were confident they could navigate the land safely. So, in high spirits, the bunch made their journey homeward. Guided by only the pale light of the late summer moon, the group moved quickly through the darkened backcountry. But 3 of them, Lance Bucke, Taylor Montague, and Sarah Halfers, lagged behind the rest of their friends. Perhaps less confident in their navigational skills than the rest of their peers, they clasped hands to help guide each other. Eventually, the trio came upon an embankment that they didn't quite recognize. Just below, a wide, bubbling pit of superheated water lay unassuming before them. But in the dim light, this pit appeared to be little more than a narrow stream, easily crossable. Entirely oblivious to the danger before them, the 3 leapt over the pool together, barely managing to land on the dirt protrusion on the other side. But before they could regain their footing, the ledge of dirt crumbled below them, simultaneously plunging Lance, Tyler, and Sarah into the boiling water. Further up the trail, the rest of the group heard the trio's cries for help and immediately rushed back to their aid. By the time they got there, Lance and Tyler had been able to pull themselves out of the pool, and a few friends took them to the nearby Old Faithful clinic for help. The other friends pulled Sarah from the blistering water and waited beside her until help arrived. It's believed that because she was much shorter than the 2 young men, she had been the most thoroughly immersed, exposing her entire body to the boiling water and making her condition much, much worse. Park spokeswoman Marsha Curl said the small group moved Sarah back to the Firehole River and placed her in the water, hoping to cool and relieve her injuries. Medical assistance finally arrived 30 minutes later, and the 3 victims were driven to the west side of Yellowstone, then airlifted by helicopter to Idaho Falls, and then finally flown by plane to Salt Lake City. 18-year-olds Tyler and Lance both survived, but were left with 2nd and 3rd degree burns. Tyler having over 70% of his body burned, and Lance over 90%. 20-year-old Sarah Hulfers suffered 3rd degree burns on her entire body, and tragically died in the hospital. According to those around her, Sarah was incredibly happy working in Yellowstone that summer, and her loss was deeply felt by her colleagues and loved ones. Of the 22 Yellowstone National Park hot springs deaths, all of them are horrific results of accidents or careless behavior, except this one. In July of 1981, David Kerwin and his friend Ronald Radcliffe were driving through Yellowstone's Fountain Paint Pond thermal area, accompanied by Ronald's dog Moosey. Because dogs are prohibited near the boiling mud pits, the 2 men parked their truck and left Moosey behind. Moosey, eager to explore the new environment, somehow escaped from the vehicle and ran to find her owner and his friend. She eventually found them casually observing the hot spring. Seeing nothing but a pool of water, Moosey excitedly ran past the 2 men and jumped headlong into the nearby Celestine pool. Startled by the yelps and cries of his friend's dog, David began preparing himself to leap in after the dog. Onlookers warned and begged David not to jump in, but David shouted back, "Like hell I won't." He then took 2 steps into the 202-degree water and then dove in headfirst after Moosey. David swam to his friend's dog trying to assist her out, but his excruciating injuries overwhelmed him and he swam to shore to try to preserve himself. Ronald stepped into the water to pull David out, giving himself 2nd-degree burns on his feet. Moosey quickly perished in the boiling cauldron, but sadly David's demise would be much slower. After emerging from the pool, witnesses reported David's eyes looking whitish and blind, and when a park visitor tried removing one of his shoes, David's skin slipped off with it. But despite these horrific injuries, David remained coherent and managed to mutter that he was stupid. "How bad am I? That was a stupid thing I did." David was hastily transferred to the Old Faithful Clinic after being administered fluids and medicine for his pain. He was taken to a hospital in Salt Lake City, where, tragically, he would succumb to his injuries the next morning. Though they are somewhat infrequent, deaths in Yellowstone's hot springs date back many, many years. Our next story will take us back to August of 1905, when 40-year-old Miss Fanny A Weeks was enjoying her stay at Yellowstone National Park. She was touring with a small group of other park visitors, led by Robert Wiley, who was reported to provide extremely interesting guided trips. The bunch was travelling via stagecoach on Yellowstone's dirt road system. Robert walked us to our group through the southwest section of the park around Old Faithful, the park's first named and most frequently erupting geyser. Robert later reported that Miss Fanny was most captivated by the hot springs. Taking notice of this, he warned her of the dangers, claiming she was too venturesome. Dressed in her all-black attire, with a fashionable black veil covering her face, Miss Fanny likely ignored Robert's cautionary advice. With the steaming hot springs surrounding her, she removed her foggy glasses to wipe them clear. But negligent of the uneven terrain around her, Miss Fanny stepped backward and directly into a scalding pool of water, plunging clear to her hips in water that reached 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Robert leapt into the water to rescue her, giving himself sweltering burns on his legs, arms and hands. Though Miss Fanny hadn't been fully submerged, she was wearing multiple petticoats that continued inflicting burns on her for some time after, due to them still being soaking wet with hot water. She stayed alive for 3 weeks, but eventually died of her injuries on September the 4th. Her friend Miss Hartman was at her bedside until the very end. Miss Fanny's tragic death was used as a frightening horror tale by tour guides in Yellowstone for many years to come. Another early 20th century hot spring fatality takes the cake for being the most unbelievable. in August of 1926. Reverend Gilbert A. Eakins was enjoying his Yellowstone visit with his family, his wife Patty, his son, and his parents. It was nearing sundown, so the group was likely briskly walking through the West Thumb Geyser Basin, the park's largest geyser basin on the shores of Yellowstone Lake. Reverend Gilbert must have lost his footing, because suddenly he fell into a piping hot pool of water. In an attempt to escape the pool, which at this point had only burned the lower half of his body, he accidentally plunged into another. Likely confused by the pain of his blistering burns, the Reverend unbelievably dove headfirst into the first pool he fell in. Even still, despite having been completely submerged, he somehow managed to crawl out of the spring and back onto dry land. A nearby ranger and doctor, Wendell Keith, heard the cries of a man screaming at the top of his lungs that he'd fallen into the hot springs and was badly burned. Another witness, a government truck driver named Mr. Halstead, ran with Wendell to the man's aid. The two carefully laid Reverend Gilbert on the ground and, using Mr. Halstead's knife, began cutting his clothes away. Even in the dim moonlight, Wendell was able to notice that as he removed his clothing, the Reverend's skin was peeling off with it. In just minutes, a large crowd of bystanders formed, curious to see what all the commotion was. Wendell requested some sort of comforter be placed beneath the man to ensure no foreign material stuck to and inside his burns. Once more, medical help arrived. Wendell administered half grain of morphine to relieve the Reverend's suffering. In an effort to soothe and heal the burns themselves, 3 pints of olive oil taken from a nearby road camp were used to saturate his entire body. Wendell also obtained 2 sheets from a nearby camping company, wrapping them around the Reverend and soaking these sheets in oil as well. Despite these efforts, the moment he had been fully immersed in the water, Reverend Gilbert's fate had likely already been sealed. Unknown to his caretakers at the time, his burns were just as bad internally as they were externally. Still, Wendell gave him mineral oil by mouth, hoping to soothe the burns on his esophagus and trachea, sustained by gulping in the boiling water. Reverend Gilbert remained fully conscious until he died from shock. After his death, his wife, Patty Eakins, attempted to obtain justice for her husband. She claimed that the particular pool he fell in was unnervingly close to the boardwalks, which were open to all the public. She stated that she wished ropes or railings would be placed around the pool, preventing others from meeting the same fatal fate as her husband. At this point, you might be wondering, is there a solution? If Yellowstone is so unsafe, why aren't greater safety measures taken? In reality, even fenced-in hot springs, tourists guided by tour guides, railings, and repeated warnings can't change the fact that Yellowstone is a wilderness, and to make it completely safe means making it no longer wild. In short, the solution is not sanitation, but education. When visiting such charming, untamed nature, always be aware of the unforgiving wilderness around you. And if you visit Yellowstone, whatever you do, always stay on the boardwalk. This has been Gripping Horror. I hope to see you in the next one.